If this connection has been haunting your mind lately, this message may explain why. Because the moment you stopped chasing, they started feeling the possibility of losing you for real. And according to Carl Jung, nothing destabilizes the human ego more than losing emotional control over someone who awakened the shadow inside them. And what changed recently was not only them, it was you. Something in your energy shifted. Something once restless inside you became quieter, steadier, harder to disturb. They felt that shift immediately, even if they never admitted it aloud. Human beings notice absence more deeply than presence. They notice when warmth disappears from familiar places. The moment you stopped chasing, stopped explaining, stopped forcing your energy toward someone who could not fully receive it, something in them opened in fear. Place your hand on your chest for a second. Feel the warmth there beneath your palm. That warmth is real. It is the same sensation that rises inside them every time your name crosses their mind unexpectedly. Every song, every memory, every small reminder touches a place they have spent months pretending no longer exists. But the unconscious mind does not obey denial forever. You were never too emotional. You were never too intense. In reality, you became the mirror that forced them to confront parts of themselves they had carefully hidden beneath their persona. Carl Jung believed every person carries two selves. The first is the persona, the mask designed for the world. The second is the shadow, the hidden emotional truth buried beneath fear, pride, and conditioning. Most people spend years protecting the persona while pretending the shadow is not there. But certain connections force the shadow into the light. That is why this bond felt different from ordinary attraction. It was not simply romance, it was recognition. Something ancient inside both of you noticed itself in the other person, and recognition creates disturbance. The ego does not like losing control. The ego prefers distance over vulnerability because distance feels safer than truth. Before going further, you need to hear something clearly. The confusion you experienced was not created entirely in your head. You were responding to mixed signals because mixed signals were truly there. One moment, they moved close to you. The next moment, they disappeared emotionally. One day, they acted warm. The next day, cold and unreachable. You kept trying to understand which version was real. The answer is that both were real. One came from the heart. The other came from fear. People often think silence means absence of feeling, but silence can also be the sound of emotional conflict happening beneath the surface. A person who feels nothing does not continuously check your energy from a distance. A person who truly moved on does not revisit old conversations at night or stare at your profile while trying to convince themselves they no longer care. What you interpreted as inconsistency was often an internal battle between attachment and self-protection. And perhaps the hardest part of this experience was feeling alone inside it. You questioned yourself constantly. You wondered whether you had invented depth where there was only temporary affection. You asked yourself why your intuition refused to let go even when logic demanded closure. But intuition operates differently from logic. Logic measures visible facts. Intuition notices invisible movement. There were signs that stayed with you, moments when they suddenly appeared after you emotionally detached. Strange timing, unfinished conversations, dreams that carried emotional weight long after waking up. These things affected you because the psyche speaks through patterns before it speaks through direct language. Carl Jung once suggested that what remains unconscious eventually appears in our lives as fate. That is exactly what happens in emotional connections like this. The feelings people refuse to face internally begin expressing themselves externally through strange behavior, emotional distance, indirect communication, and repeated cycles. You probably noticed the pattern yourself. Whenever you began stepping away, they returned in subtle ways, maybe through a short message, maybe through social media, maybe through sudden curiosity about your life. Not enough to fully commit, but enough to re-enter your emotional field. At first, this behavior seemed confusing, but psychologically, it makes perfect sense. The moment someone feels they may actually lose access to you, the ego begins reacting defensively. Not because they stopped caring, but because they suddenly realize the emotional safety they depended on may no longer be guaranteed. This creates what psychologists often describe as attachment panic. Attachment panic does not always appear dramatically. Sometimes it appears quietly. A person checks your profile late at night. They reread old messages. They post things hoping you will notice. They become unusually aware of your absence. Their nervous system reacts before their conscious mind fully understands what is happening. Touch your wrist for a moment and feel your pulse. The body always notices emotional truth before the mind creates explanations for it. The body remembers people even when the ego tries to forget. That is why they began testing the connection instead of speaking directly. Fear rarely communicates honestly at first. Fear communicates indirectly. Instead of saying, "I miss you," someone sends a casual message. Instead of admitting vulnerability, they create distance and wait to see if you will cross it for them. Instead of confessing feelings openly, they search for reassurance through small emotional experiments. These tests were never as casual as they appeared. Every delayed reply, every small attempt to reappear in your life, every carefully measured interaction carried a hidden question underneath it. The question was simple. Do I still matter to you? And yet something changed in the dynamic. You stopped responding from desperation. You stopped rearranging your emotional state around their inconsistency. Maybe slowly, maybe painfully, but you began returning your energy to yourself. That shift frightened them more than any argument ever could. When you no longer chase, people are forced to encounter themselves. As long as you continuously reached toward them, they could avoid fully facing the emotional consequences of their behavior. Your constant presence acted like emotional protection. But once your energy became quieter, they were left alone with the reality of their own feelings. Carl Jung believed the shadow becomes strongest when ignored. Every emotion buried beneath pride eventually searches for expression. Love denied does not disappear. It transforms into restlessness, anxiety, dreams, longing, emotional confusion, and inner conflict. And this is where the dreams begin. During the day, people can distract themselves. They stay busy. They rationalize. They convince themselves they're fine. But dreams bypass the conscious defenses of the ego. In dreams, the unconscious speaks honestly. That is why your presence continued appearing in their inner world, even when they tried convincing themselves the connection no longer mattered. In dreams, you were calm, whole, untouched by chasing, and strangely, that calmness affected them more deeply than emotional pursuit ever did, because the version of you that stopped begging for clarity became the version they could no longer control emotionally. Many people confuse attachment with love because attachment is loud, while real love often moves quietly beneath the surface. Attachment screams in fear of abandonment. Love observes. Love remembers. Love remains present long after distractions fail. This does not mean every painful connection is destined, but some connections undeniably trigger psychological transformation. They awaken hidden fears, hidden wounds, hidden desires, and hidden aspects of identity. They pull unconscious material into awareness. You became that catalyst for them. Without fully intending to, you forced them to confront emotional truths they had avoided for years. The warmth they felt around you exposed how emotionally disconnected they had become from themselves. The honesty in your presence challenged the emotional mask they relied on with everyone else. And when someone is not ready for that level of emotional exposure, they often retreat. Retreat does not always mean rejection. Sometimes retreat is the ego attempting to regain control after feeling emotionally overwhelmed. The strange part is that the more emotionally steady you became, the more their inner world destabilized. They expected you to continue waiting. They expected access to your emotional energy to remain available whenever they returned. But your silence changed the structure of the connection. They began noticing your absence in ordinary moments. A song would suddenly remind them of you. A familiar place would feel incomplete. They would open their phone intending to distract themselves and somehow end up staring at your name. This is not because the universe is punishing them. It is because emotional truth cannot remain buried forever. The psyche constantly pushes unresolved feelings back toward consciousness. And beneath all of this sits one fear stronger than the rest. The fear that it may already be too late. That fear grows quietly inside people who realize they may have damaged something real. They start wondering whether your warmth has disappeared permanently, whether your peace now exists without them, whether the version of you who once waited has finally moved on emotionally. That is why indirect communication increases after emotional detachment. A person begins reaching back carefully, almost nervously. They want reassurance before risking vulnerability. They test the emotional temperature of the connection before exposing what they truly feel. But here's the deeper truth. This experience was never only about them. It was also about your transformation. Somewhere inside this painful cycle, you started becoming someone different, someone more grounded, someone less willing to abandon themselves for inconsistent affection, someone beginning to understand their own value beyond another person's emotional availability. The spiritual traditions Jung studied often describe transformation as a descent into darkness before rebirth. The hero enters confusion before discovering truth. The shadow must be faced before integration becomes possible, and you have already started crossing that threshold. You no longer wake up measuring your worth through their attention. You no longer spend every quiet moment trying to decode hidden meaning inside their silence. Slowly you stopped performing emotional labor for someone unwilling to meet you with equal honesty. That does not mean you stopped caring. It means you stopped abandoning yourself. And ironically, That is exactly when the energy changed. The moment your nervous system stopped revolving entirely around them, your presence became magnetic in a different way. Calmness carries power. Emotional steadiness unsettles people who expected permanent access to your vulnerability. This is why they began feeling your absence more intensely after you emotionally detached. Not because you became colder, but because your energy became whole. Real wholeness cannot be manipulated. And for someone still trapped between persona and shadow, that kind of emotional independence becomes unforgettable. Voiceover script, part 2. There is a stage in every deep connection where silence stops feeling empty and starts revealing truth. Most people misunderstand this stage completely. They assume silence means the story ended. But psychologically, silence often becomes the space where unresolved emotions grow loudest. At night, distractions disappear. The persona weakens. The carefully managed version of the self begins losing control, and that is when the unconscious rises. They may look normal during the day. They answer messages. They continue routines. They laugh in conversations. But internally, something keeps returning to you, no matter how hard they try redirecting their attention elsewhere. The psyche behaves strangely when confronted with emotional loss. It circles back repeatedly to what still carries emotional charge. That is why they revisit old memories, why certain conversations replay in their mind unexpectedly, why they remember details they once acted indifferent toward. A person who genuinely feels nothing does not repeatedly reopen emotional doors in private. Some nights, they probably stared at old messages longer than they intended. Some nights, they typed something and deleted it before sending. Some nights, they convinced themselves they were finally over it, only to dream about you hours later. Dreams matter here because dreams reveal what consciousness is suppressing. Jung believed dreams compensate for the imbalance between conscious identity and unconscious truth. If someone spends the day pretending they no longer care, the unconscious often corrects that lie at night. That is why you continued appearing there, not always dramatically, sometimes quietly. A simple conversation, a familiar feeling, your presence sitting peacefully beside them. Yet the emotional effect remained powerful because your calmness represented something their inner world still lacked. They expected distance to erase feeling. Instead, distance amplified awareness. The ego hates this experience because it destroys the illusion of control. People want to believe they can decide what matters emotionally through logic alone. But deep emotional bonds rarely obey pure logic. The heart remembers what the mind attempts to exile, and eventually, the emotional pressure begins leaking outward through behavior. This is when small signals appear. A sudden interaction online, a subtle attempt to become visible again, a carefully neutral message carrying emotional weight beneath ordinary words. They may convince themselves these actions mean nothing, but psychologically, they mean everything. Every indirect reach is the nervous system searching for emotional safety. The irony is that they often become more afraid precisely because your energy changed. Earlier in the connection, they relied on certainty. They knew you would respond emotionally. They knew your attention remained available. But now there is distance inside your calmness, not punishment, not revenge, simply self-respect. And self-respect forces clarity. When someone can no longer depend on emotional access to you, they finally confront the possibility of losing you for real. That realization opens the shadow. Carl Jung described the shadow as the hidden part of the psyche containing everything rejected, denied, or feared. In relationships, the shadow appears through projection. People accuse others of emotional intensity while secretly terrified of their own feelings. They criticize vulnerability while desperately longing for connection. You likely experience this directly. At times, they may have treated your emotions as excessive, even while their own behavior revealed deep emotional conflict. That contradiction exists because projection transfers inner discomfort outward. People who fear vulnerability often feel threatened by those who express it honestly. But eventually, projection fails. The shadow cannot remain buried forever because emotional truth always searches for expression. What begins as emotional avoidance eventually becomes emotional exhaustion. That exhaustion is where surrender starts. Not dramatic surrender, not immediate confession. Usually it begins quietly. They stop being able to ignore your absence emotionally. Their distractions lose effectiveness. The emotional walls they depended on begin weakening from the inside. And beneath all of this sits another realization they rarely say aloud. You changed, not superficially, not performatively, deeply. The version of you who once chased reassurance is fading. In its place stands someone more emotionally integrated, someone capable of loving without collapsing into fear, someone beginning to understand that self-worth cannot depend entirely on another person's inconsistency. This transformation matters because emotional dynamics shift when one person stops operating from scarcity. Earlier, your nervous system may have treated every response from them like survival. Their silence created anxiety. Their attention created temporary relief. But healing begins when your emotional center returns to you. That return changes everything. Suddenly, their mixed signals no longer control your entire emotional reality. Their inconsistency stops defining your identity. You begin noticing how much energy you once spent shrinking yourself around their uncertainty. And perhaps for the first time, you stop asking whether you are enough. You realize the deeper question was whether they were emotionally ready enough to receive something genuine. That realization creates sacred stillness. Sacred stillness is not emotional coldness. It is not detachment rooted in bitterness. It is the calm that appears when someone finally chooses themselves without needing another person's permission. People feel this energy instinctively. That is why they notice your silence differently now. Earlier silence felt temporary because they believed they still had emotional access to you. But your current stillness carries emotional finality they cannot easily predict. For the first time, they sense you may truly continue growing without waiting for them. And strangely, that possibility awakens honesty. Not immediately, perhaps. Fear still delays expression. Pride still interferes. But internally, the conflict grows louder. The distance they once created for protection slowly becomes unbearable. This is the paradox Jung understood deeply. The parts of ourselves we avoid eventually control us from the unconscious. Fear avoided becomes fate. Emotion denied becomes obsession. Love unspoken becomes inner torment. They may still appear hesitant outwardly, yet internally, emotional recognition keeps expanding. The signs are subtle but real. Increased awareness of your absence, emotional reactions to ordinary reminders, difficulty replacing the emotional connection with superficial distractions, recurring memories carrying unusual emotional intensity. None of this guarantees a specific outcome. Human beings still have free will. Fear can delay action for long periods, but emotional truth leaves traces everywhere, and your intuition noticed those traces long before your logic understood them. Still, this story cannot end with obsession about another person's return, because the most important transformation happened inside you. You stopped begging for clarity from someone unwilling to communicate honestly. You stopped sacrificing your peace for temporary emotional reassurance. You stopped confusing emotional inconsistency with destiny. That does not erase love. It simply places love inside healthier boundaries. Boundaries matter spiritually and psychologically because they protect identity from dissolving into emotional chaos. Jung believed individuation, the process of becoming whole, required integrating hidden parts of the self instead of abandoning them for approval. And perhaps this connection forced exactly that process inside you. It forced you to confront your fear of abandonment, your fear of not being chosen, your tendency to overextend emotionally for unavailable people. But it also revealed your capacity for deep feeling, loyalty, intuition, patience, and emotional resilience. The shadow does not only contain darkness, it also contains hidden strength. That strength is emerging now. You can feel it in the way your mornings changed, in the way you slowly reclaimed your routines, in the way silence no longer destroys you the way it once did. Healing rarely happens dramatically. Most healing happens quietly. One morning you realize you checked your phone less. One evening you notice your peace lasted longer than your anxiety. One conversation no longer sends your nervous system into collapse. That is growth. And growth alters relationships at an energetic level. People sense when someone no longer needs validation from them. They feel the emotional shift immediately, even if they cannot explain it consciously. This is why they continue circling back emotionally. The version of you they once took for granted no longer exists in the same way. Now there is steadiness where desperation used to live. There is dignity where over-explaining once lived. There is self-respect where fear once controlled your choices. And that transformation changes the entire emotional structure between you. Whether they eventually speak fully or not, one truth remains undeniable. You are no longer the person waiting at the door. You became the person capable of walking forward with or without external reassurance. That is the real turning point, because genuine transformation does not happen when another person finally chooses you. It happens when you stop abandoning yourself while waiting to be chosen. Carl Jung once suggested that enlightenment comes not from imagining figures of light, but from making the darkness conscious. You face darkness inside this connection: confusion, rejection, fear, longing, emotional uncertainty. But instead of remaining trapped there forever, you started becoming aware of your patterns, aware of your worth, aware of the difference between chasing and genuine love, aware that emotional peace matters, and awareness changes destiny. Now, when they think about you, they are not only remembering your warmth, They are confronting the version of themselves that appeared around you, the version capable of deeper feeling, the version that felt emotionally alive. That is difficult to forget. Some connections remain psychologically significant because they awaken dormant parts of identity. They interrupt emotional numbness. They expose the gap between persona and authentic self. You became that mirror, and mirrors are frightening because they reveal truth. Yet your task now is no longer to force awakening inside someone else. Your task is to continue becoming whole. Continue protecting your peace. Continue building a life that does not revolve around emotional uncertainty. Continue honoring the version of yourself that survived this experience without losing its capacity to love. Because regardless of what happens next, that transformation is real. You are no longer running after signals trying to prove your value. You are no longer shrinking yourself so someone else feels comfortable avoiding vulnerability. You are no longer measuring your worth through another person's inconsistency. You became steadier, wiser, more conscious, and paradoxically, that is exactly what makes your energy unforgettable. So, if this message found you tonight, trust the reason it did. Not because it guarantees a specific ending, but because it reminds you of something essential. You were never crazy for feeling deeply. You were never weak for loving honestly. And you were never meant to lose yourself inside someone else's fear. The universe may bring people together for many reasons, sometimes for comfort, sometimes for awakening, sometimes to expose wounds that still need healing. But the deepest connections always leave transformation behind, and you have already transformed. That is why the silence no longer carries the same power over you. That is why your calmness feels different. That is why they noticed the shift. And that is why, somewhere beneath all the confusion, your soul already knows the truth. You stop chasing, and in doing so, you finally return to yourself.